Now, this video channel and podcast series is called Analog to Digital. It's a tech memoir of all the important tech that I engaged with growing up throughout my life. But not all tech, as we think of it, comes in the form of a handheld device. Small, tangible, compact, with buttons and features and things like that. No, that is certainly not the case with my next tech nomination. As some of you will know, I was born in Sweden, and 1977 was the year that I turned 4. This was the year that the Apple Computer Company was incorporated. The miniseries Roots by Alex Haley aired on television to a record 100 million viewers. And, believe it or not, snow fell in Miami. It was a significant year in my life because that was the year that I moved from Europe to Australia. And to get there, we flew on a magnificent new aircraft. My tech nomination for 1977 is the Boeing 747. This cutting-edge piece of technology had many names, including the Queen of the Skies, and as us oldies call it, it was the Jumbo Jet. It's hard looking back at it just how radical this airplane really was. It's often described as having shrunk the world single-handedly. Now, you might think that the Concorde, which was also flying at the time, represented the future of aviation, but instead it was the Boeing 747 that really changed the game. While the Concorde roared and other jets simply screamed as they flew overhead, the buzz, or the whir even, of the 747's engines were relatively quiet. And in terms of aviation and world travel, the Boeing 747 changed everything by allowing more people to fly further for less money. It literally made international air travel affordable. Its maiden flight was in 1969, and Pan Am was the first to fly a commercial Boeing 747 in 1970. But over the next 2 years, Boeing only sold 2 more aircraft. There was a slow take-up in orders, despite 20 airlines having expressed interest initially. One of these first 2 aircraft that were sold was to Air India, but it wasn't until the 1973 oil crisis, which killed off ordinary air travel for a number of years, that finally got the ball rolling. Airlines such as Lufthansa and British Airways bought a number of 747s simply because they were more fuel efficient than any other aircraft. Then Japanese JAL Airlines bought a number of aircraft in 1973, and from there on, the 747 would become a commercial success. Sales of the prestigious aircraft suddenly started booming. Now, one of the noteworthy things about the 747 was the hump, or second deck, on top of the aircraft. This was new in commercial aviation. And the original 100 model had 3 windows up top, while the next model, the 747-200, had 8 windows up top. The later 747-8 model had as many as 23 windows on each side and a door. That's how you can actually date a 747, by looking at the number of windows up here. The 747 was also famous for being so big that it had 2 aisles running down the center of the aircraft. That was unheard of. And not only that, the economy class seats back in those days were made of real leather. So when I first moved to Australia in 1977, we first had to fly to Rome in order to get the Air India 747 flight from there. Air India really were among the first airlines to fly this aircraft. Now, I ended up traveling a lot as a kid, and I probably flew the 747 from Australia and Europe probably 20 times or so. My favorite airline to fly back then was Singapore Airlines, but more often than not, we flew the more affordable Garuda, Malaysian Airlines, or Thai Airways. I remember flying in those 747s with great fondness. In those early days, it could take as long as 36 hours to fly from Europe to Australia, with all the stopovers and refueling stops included. In my case, I remember it being either Singapore or Dubai, where we stopped along the way. And one of the good things about Dubai and Singapore was the amazing duty-free shops that had lots and lots of electronics that I would buy new gadgets from over the years. I remember buying this very oil panic Nintendo console in Singapore airport. It was happy days. With today's aircraft, we have Wi-Fi, telephone signal, and personalized movie screens for games and films, but there was not a lot to do in the back of a 747 in those days. Or was there? One thing you could do on a 747 in those days was you could smoke. There was even a dedicated smoking section at the back, and you could literally smoke the entire way to Australia. You could effectively smoke non-stop for 36 hours, whether a smoker or non-smoker. Can you imagine it? There were no screens on the backs of seats, as I mentioned, in those days. Instead, there were in-flight movies, which I always looked forward to, but they came in the form of an overhead projector that literally beamed the film on the back wall of the center galleys. You could listen to the movie by the headphones that you stuck into your armrest next to the built-in ashtray. These headphones also gave the option of various radio stations that you could listen to pass the time. The 747 was a big, stable aircraft, even in bad weather. But one of my fondest memories of flying the 747 was in bad weather and turbulence, and I used to run and jump in the aisle and try to time it as the tail bobbed up and down to experience true weightlessness 7 miles up in the air. The thing is, you were actually allowed to walk, or should I say stroll, up and down the aisle. People used to socialize in little corners and get to know each other, and who knows what else. Imagine the strolling part, I mean. Now, obviously, I was only a kid, so for me, the best thing about flying in those days was being able to go up and visit the cockpit. There was nothing better than hearing that special announcement over the speaker when the pilot said, "If there are any boys and girls and some parents who wish to see the cockpit, then make your way up to the top deck." This happened on every flight and sometimes on every leg that I flew on. See, the pilots were just as proud to show off their queen of the skies as the airlines were. And walking to the front, up to first class, and going up those spiral stairs to the top deck in order to wait at the cockpit was an amazing experience as a kid. And if I'm not mistaken, in those days there were actually 3 people in the cockpit: the pilot, the co-pilot, and the radio operator, the one whose job it was to maintain contact with ground control via the radio. This was something I always looked forward to, and even if the queues sometimes were long, we did have all the time in the world to wait. We could simply take all the time in the world. It was probably good for the pilots as well to break the monotony of those long flights. Now, none of these things are allowed these days. The aviation industry eventually figured out that a cigarette dropped on the floor during landing while strapped in was a major cause of fire on board, leading to many lost aircraft and many deaths. And eventually that smoking section was abandoned. And now visiting the cockpit is also now out of the question for obvious reasons. But it did take decades for that rule to come into force. The 747 was a technological wonder, and it was always in the news, but not always for good reasons. Already in 1970, there was one hijacking that led to a 747 being blown up in Cairo, and then another one, and then another one. One 747 was lost every year between 1974 and 1976, and some of those were deliberate. And then in 1977, 2 747s, one KLM and the other Pan Am, crashed into each other while taxiing during heavy fog at Tenerife Airport. And that collision remains the largest aircraft disaster of all time, with 538 people losing their lives. The Pan Am in this incident was actually that very first 747 that was taken into commercial service back in 1970. 8 747s were lost in the 1970s alone. Then, of course, in the 1980s, there was the Lockerbie example, which ultimately forced the Pan Am company to cease trading and go out of business. That was a famous yet tragic disaster. On a positive note, in 1978, The first woman pilot was allowed to fly a 747 after many objections from male pilots. She was even a former flight attendant. Such was the novelty of having a female pilot that even in 1984, that same pilot flew across the Atlantic, landing in the UK as the first female pilot to ever do so. She was lauded in the press, people celebrated, and she was even named Woman of the Year in the UK press, just for flying a plane. It was in 1987 that the Air Force One presidential jet switched to a modified version of the 747, and the last aircraft of this kind was built and delivered in 2023. Of the 1,600 Boeing 747s built, there are believed to be some 50 still operating commercially today by 4 airlines, as well as more than 100 cargo versions of this aircraft. Now, we flew that Air India 747 from Rome to Bombay back in October 1977. At that time, we also had a stopover in Dubai for refueling, and then once in India, we had to stay overnight to catch a connecting 747 to take us to Melbourne. Just 2.5 months later, that very same Air India aircraft, one of the originals from 1972, took off from Bombay heading for Dubai, but crashed into the sea just 2 minutes after takeoff, killing everyone on board. This accident is testament to just how cutting-edge long-distance aircraft travel was in those days. As exciting as it was, anyone who felt a fear of flying was certainly justified in feeling that way. This has been a slightly longer video than normal, but here's to my tech nomination for 1977, the Boeing 747. Cheers!